We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
This island's furious to hear about these things.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Planet Holyrood, the show which examines the latest goings on in Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in this week for Paul Hutchin, who's taking a well-earned holiday. There is, of course, only one political story dominating the headlines this week, and that is the sudden death of Alex Salmond, the former First Minister and lifelong campaigner for Scottish independence. Now, joining me today to discuss Salmond's life and legacy, as well as asking what comes next for the two parties that he led, are two distinguished journalists who need little introduction to regular listeners. We have Hannah Rodger, the chief reporter at the Sunday Mail, and Douglas Dickie, who is content editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, shortly before we started recording, it was confirmed that Salmond's body will be flown home to Scotland on Friday, with a private funeral likely to take place later this month. Now, I'm sure listeners will be more than familiar with Salmond and his achievements in politics, but to be very brief, they include such things as two separate spells as leader of the SNP, becoming the first nationalist leader to win power at Holyrood and securing a referendum in independence in 2014. So Hannah, coming to you first, Salmond has been described in various obituaries and think pieces this week as the single most consequential Scottish politician of the last 50 years. Is that a fair summary, do you think?
You know, obviously he achieved a huge amount in terms of the independence movement, but, you know, there have been other politicians who have also been very consequential. Donald Dewar springs to mind, for example. But, you know, I don't think it's unfair to describe him as, you know, very sort of, he leaves a massive legacy. And I think, you know, what he's done for the independence movement can't really be underestimated. And to be fair to him as well, you know, when he was First Minister, I think that he, you know, achieved quite a lot in terms of governance, like just good governance of Scotland, in a way that, you know, unfortunately we can't really say there has been in the time since he stepped down. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but I think, you know, we were kind of speaking about it on Saturday. Obviously, I was working on Saturday, and I think, you know, you can argue whether you like Salmond or you didn't and his policies around government, but when he was First Minister, I think that people did have the sense that he was in control and that he had, you know, a grip on things in a way that you just don't really get that sense, particularly under, you know, the latter stages of Nicola Sturgeon, also John Swinney just now, and Humza. You know, things just don't seem to be working anymore the way that they used to. And I don't know if it's fair to say that's, you know, Salmond's leadership or if it's just the circumstances that we're in just now. But yeah.
Just on the policies that you mentioned there, Hannah, I think that's important to talk about because a lot of what has been mentioned in Salmond this week is focused understandably on independence, and that being his life's work, obviously. But is there anything that jumps out to you from his record as First Minister and leading the Scottish Government in terms of policies?
The tuition fees. Obviously, you know, he is sort of credited with scrapping tuition fees at universities in Scotland. And I think, you know, whether you agree with that or not, you know, some people believe that it's, you know, having a sort of knock-on effect on funding now for universities and the number of international students and the reliance on them. But I think, you know, fundamentally it has increased sort of access to university education for a huge number of people in Scotland. And I think that's a pretty good thing. Dougie, I don't know if you've got any obvious sort of government things that you think, you know, Salmond should be recognised for.
Well, I think the first thing I'd obviously would say, first of all, is obviously condolences to Alex Salmond's family and friends. It's easy for us to kind of comb through his career now. But it's easy to forget that, for some people they've lost a loved one. I mean, free tuition fees. The other one, of course, was free prescription charges. And I think you could argue that he's maybe left the SNP in a bit of a bind with that. They're so committed to these policies, but at the end of the day, it's policies that are costing the country money. We've seen it in terms of the tuition fees. It's getting, universities are having to fill their courses with foreign students just to raise some money. But ultimately, I think he done okay between 2007, 2011. After that, everything was about the NDRF, and will his record in government will be examined. I mean, his legacy is the NDRF. That's what everyone will remember him for. And in some ways, his legacy is the aftermath of the NDRF, which hasn't been particularly pleasant for a lot of people. I think it caused division. It's left Scotland, standing still for the past decade. So I think we need to be careful about, eulogising him too much in terms of his achievements, because ultimately, no matter what he kind of done before 2014, he will be remembered for what happened in 2014 and, what's kind of subsequently happened since.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well, Dickie, because you're saying about how the NDRF, caused divisions and things, but I think it still continues to, even and I feel like it's kind of getting worse. It's getting more polarised, and that could be, the sort of prominence of social media in the debate and things. But, I feel like it's much more tribal now than it was before. I don't know, Chris, what do you think?
I think that's fair. I mean, we all remember the NDRF and worked through it. And we've all seen the rise in social media over the last decade to the point that we're at now, where political debate, or debate on any subject really, not just politics, but on the social media world, it's so polarised. I think on the referendum, well, obviously, if you are, on the Better Together side, or were completely political, I think a lot of people did look at that time thinking, why are we going through this? I'm perfectly, well, maybe not content, but I'm reasonably happy with the status quo, and I don't want to have to imagine the breakup of the UK. But on a purely on a political level, the fact that that referendum happened, given the difficulty that Scotland has faced in trying to force an NDRF too, the fact that referendum happened at all was an achievement for Alex Salmond, because for a long time, SNP policy had been, if we win the most MPs at a general election, that would be a mandate for independence. The problem the SNP had, though, was they were making that argument in the 1980s and 1990s when they were returning a handful of MPs, and there was a snowball's chance in hell that was going to happen. So the fact that Salmond, got his party to adopt that referendum strategy and then delivered a mandate in 2011 when, the SNP won a thumping majority at Holyrood, the fact that referendum happened at all is pretty extraordinary. Given the political climate right now, I think it's safe to say we're not going to see another referendum for a long time. It may happen in the future, but in the short to medium term, it looks extremely unlikely. But I wondered if we could talk maybe briefly about Salmond the man. As journalists, I'm sure you've had encounters with him. Were there any that stood out really? Like, what were your dealings with him, Hannah? How did you find him?
I remember the very first time I met Alex Salmond, and it was when I was a trainee reporter at the then Evening Times. And I got sent along to this thing at the Glasgow Science Centre, and it sounds really bizarre, but it was some scientist had developed this model of a human head that was meant to be used for dentists to train themselves on how to inject anaesthetic. So it was like linked up to some computer program, and you had this kind of fake syringe thing, and when you injected, basically you could feel the pressure and stuff as if you were injecting into a real human mouth. And for some reason, Alex Salmond was at the launch of this head. And that's the very first time I met him, and he was First Minister at that point. And I just thought, this is really weird. Why is he here? But I do remember, when I spoke to him, he came across as very sort of obviously confident, very charismatic. I do remember he stood far too close to me and made me feel slightly uncomfortable. But anyway, but he didn't, I think he always knew with the press he has to be kind of switched on and be a certain way. But I didn't get the sense that, he saw me as this young sort of female trainee who was a bit, didn't know what they were doing. He kind of treated me like he would treat probably, someone much more experienced. And then obviously, over the years, I've had various sort of dealings with him, and sometimes they've been pleasant and sometimes they haven't been. And I think that's probably the same for any journalist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is that something that you recognise, Douglas, in your dealings with him?
Yeah, I only actually, because I spent quite a lot of time in local news, and by the time I'd moved into kind of national news, Alex Salmond was kind of yesterday's man. I only actually met him once, and it was I think it was 2000. It was either 2012 or 2013, and he came to Rutherglen when I was working at the Reformer, and he tried to boost yes support or whatever, and I was allowed a few minutes with him, and the thing that always stood out for me is I'm pretty sure his shirt was untucked, which I always found very bizarre, for a politician of his standing. I just thought, you'd think somebody would maybe have said to him, Alec, your shirt tail's hanging out, but he didn't seem to mind. He was very confident. If he was chocolate, he'd have eaten himself. But I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. Some people say that about me. So, I asked him how will Rutherglen vote in the referendum, and he was absolutely adamant. Rutherglen will vote yes. Rutherglen didn't vote yes. Neither did South Lanarkshire. But he seemed at the time perfectly personable, and I think at that stage, before the referendum was when he was at his peak. I think seeing him later on in through the prism of the news, I think he became a greatly reduced figure. I wrote this week that I thought he'd become more myth than man, mainly because ultimately his political career ended in failure. His Alba party is, won 11,000 seats, 11,000 votes, at the general election, and he just latterly, I thought he felt like yesterday's man, which I guess he was, and I think a lot of what he takes credit for is actually happened since 2014 when he wasn't there. The peak of independent support happened 6 years after he was First Minister, and 2 years after he'd left the SNP, 3 years after he'd been a politician. So I think we need to remember the reality of it. He was, alongside Nigel Farage. I'd say him and Nigel Farage are the two most important politicians in the UK since Tony Blair. But whereas Farage, right now is still riding high, and he won Brexit, Salmond ultimately failed, despite having every advantage going for him, being able to pick the question, pick the date, and I just think in recent years he was kind of pitching to the fringes of the nationalist movement, and I don't think it was a great look for him, if I'm being honest.
I think a couple of points you make there are absolutely correct. Like the first one about Salmond being in his absolute peak in the years before the referendum, I think that's absolutely correct. I remember being at a few campaign events in the weeks before the referendum, September 2014, and Salmond, there was a period Salmond had to wear a sling on his arm because he was shaking so many hands, like glad handing so many people in crowds, that he was effectively getting repetitive stress syndrome. He was effectively knacking himself by working the crowds, and it really was a sort of extraordinary moment in Scottish political history, whatever you thought of him, whatever you thought of the referendum. But to go back to the point I made before, the fact he got that referendum at all, that is the one time really that the support for independence was tested, because for all the polls, the support for independence remains high now. There's no prospect of that being tested again at a referendum in the short to medium term. I think also we'll come on to Alba a bit later, and whether or not there's any realistic prospect of the campaign, Alba's campaign for the 2026 elections, whether there's any prospect that really, going anywhere. But to sort of jump back to his later years that you touched on a bit there, Douglas, he chose Salmond to stand down as First Minister and as the leader of the SNP on the day after the referendum. Now, at the time, I thought that seemed like a sort of obvious thing to do. And it was a bit of, the political commentary was like, well, fair enough, he's had a go at the referendum. It didn't come off. He's now walking away. But Hannah, in the latter years, he seemed to really regret that. Do you think it was realistic? He could have went on, that he could have continued as leader?
Well, I don't know if he regretted it. It's hard to say, right? But obviously with everything that happened with the court case, with Nicola Sturgeon, him falling out with Nicola, the sort of plunging levels of popularity that we're seeing now for the SNP, I don't know if he was saying, it's very easy in hindsight to say, oh, I should never have stepped down. But had the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon's leadership continued to have, to gain the same level of popularity as when he stepped down, I don't think he would be saying that. Does that make sense? So yeah, I think it's quite an interesting thing for him to say, that maybe he regrets standing down. I think definitely, he's somebody probably who thinks that he can do the best job, and maybe not that everyone else is incompetent, but I do believe that he thought that he was the best person to do the job, and therefore anyone who took over from him probably wouldn't do it as well as him. So I think it would be quite easy for him to say, well, I should have just stuck at it. But also I think the thing that everyone who knows anything about Alex Salmond is he needs a project, he needs something to work on. And obviously we will talk about Alba, but maybe he was referring to it in that sense that, it would have given him something to focus on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Douglas, he did seem to struggle to find a role after he left the office of First Minister. I mean, he was for a couple of years an MP, and then Theresa May called the snap general election in 2017, which saw the SNP lose quite a few seats, including Alex Salmond's, and suddenly he was thrust out of elected office for the first time since 1990. And that around then, in the aftermath, he became controversially a host on Russia Today. Do you think there was ever any chance of a man like Alex Salmond retiring quietly into the background, or as Hannah suggested there, he was always going to have to find some kind of project to do?
Yeah, I mean, the point Hannah made is absolutely correct. Hindsight's a 100% science. He was such a divisive figure, and then the SNP replaced him with probably an even more divisive figure, which probably is why he thinks now he stood down at the wrong time. But I seem to recall, was it after 2015, or was it the lead up to 2017 election? He was openly talking about being the kingmaker at Westminster.
Yeah,
and I think Sturgeon had to give a few speeches reminding people who the leader of the SNP was, and who any kingmaker or queenmaker, as it would have been, because Theresa May was there at the time. And he obviously still, regardless of the referendum result, regardless of him standing down, regardless of election results, I think he's still seen himself in those 3 years as the de facto leader of the SNP. And given what happened, it must have been very, a knock to his ego, to be honest, when this kind of came crumbling down around him. Obviously, we know all about the complaints and the subsequent court case where he was cleared. But yeah, he just seemed like a guy that couldn't, unable to accept not being in the limelight. I mean, Russia Today was such a massive PR gaffe.
But do you not think, Dougie, that I think he revelled in that? I think he enjoyed being controversial. Like, he could have had a TV show on another station, but I think he knew that this would cause controversy, but he liked that. I think he was one of those people who was like, all publicity is good publicity, in a way,
Yeah. I done a show a few weeks ago, this show with Paul and John Ferguson, and Paul described him as Trump before Trump. And I think there's a wee bit of truth in that. Not just, the kind of populist tactics he used, but yeah, he did seem to revel in just winding people up. He was a bit of a wind-up merchant, which again, from my point of view, isn't really that much of a criticism. But I thought that was a mistake, Russia Today, and I think Alba, it's like he almost thought that all he had to do was click his fingers and something that he'd done would succeed, because he'd managed to win the Indy Ref, and he thought he could set up this new party and break the logjam in terms of the independence debate.
Yes.
And in the end, it's just completely, it's been a bit of an embarrassment for him. But I doubt he would ever have felt that embarrassment, because he was so sure of his own abilities and so sure of the fact that he was correct on everything.
Yeah. I think though as well, like, I think maybe with the Alba party, he was looking at the long game. Like, it is quite unusual for a new political party to get set up and then immediately win, at elections. Obviously, they had elected members because people defected, but I don't know. I definitely think that without him, political reporting and political landscape in Scotland is going to be a hell of a lot more boring.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. While he had become more of a marginalised figure, a reduced figure, as you said, Douglas, Salmond was never boring, and he was a wind-up merchant, as you say. But on Alba, I do fear for the long-term future. I think they will continue to the 2026 Holyrood election. The recent general election in July, the last time I saw Alex Salmond was when he had an event in Glasgow at the really well-known pub Sloan's. Alba had the upstairs function room for their grand unveiling of their candidates. Now, people might point out, well, that's really reduced circumstances. A man like Alex Salmond reduced to speaking in the upstairs room of a pub, no matter how grand a pub it is. But being at the event, it was quite remarkable. There was maybe 50 or so Alba members there, most of whom were candidates. And the atmosphere was probably pretty flat until Alex Salmond, strolled in, took to the stage, and then delivered a 5-minute stump speech as if he was on stage at the Hydro or somewhere like that. It really was impressive. He could, he was a fantastic speaker when the mood took him. And the few journalists that were there, myself included, were like, you can still turn it on when they has to. But ultimately, of course, in that general election, Alba went nowhere. I think, they got around 10,000 votes, which, considering they had about 7,000 paid members the last time I checked, not exactly a great return. But Alex Salmond admitted himself at this event that effectively it was a dry run for Alba. The people in place for the general election campaign would be the people that would be then campaigning for Holyrood in 2026. So I do think there'll be enough momentum behind them within the party that will continue to that point. But
maybe momentum, but what about money?
Well, the money is the big question, of course, because politics is not a cheap business. But I think they'll cobble together enough to get a reasonable slate of candidates. Whether it's a dozen, whether it's half a dozen, I don't know. But I'm sure they'll have a go in 2026. But can they get beyond that if they don't have anyone elected? I don't see it, frankly. But just to kind of round things up, we can't ignore, obviously, that Alex Salmond's later life was dominated by, obviously there were multiple allegations of sexual harassment and sexual assault that he faced across a Scottish Government investigation, which ultimately, proved to be botched on the Scottish Government's part. Alex Salmond successfully sued the Scottish Government, but also a separate criminal trial in which he was cleared of all charges in 2020. And there is also, separately to those two events, an ongoing litigation in which Alex Salmond is he was accusing the Scottish Government of malfeasance, effectively saying that it was acting, with spite and malice against them when it brought the initial investigation. Hannah, without having to go into all the detail of these very, very serious allegations against them, do you feel that this ultimately will be what people remember Alex Salmond for? And do you think the ongoing legal case, the malfeasance case, could prove extremely difficult for the Scottish Government down the line?
Well, on this malfeasance case, there are now questions over that, because who is going to take it forward? Obviously it was Alex Salmond, I presume in Alex Salmond's name, as in Alex Salmond versus Scottish ministers. So court cases don't really work like that. You can't just kind of substitute one person's name for another. So I don't know if someone chose to take it up, on his behalf now, would they have to start the whole process again? So that's just a sort of technical thing that I'm not entirely sure how it works. And also, I don't know if someone, Kenny McCaskill, for example, or I'm sure there are many of Alex Salmond's friends and supporters who would be keen to see that sort of settled in some way. So I think that's the question. But in terms of, will he ultimately be remembered for, the 13 counts of sexual misconduct that obviously were subsequently he was cleared of, but, people still will remember that. It's tricky because I don't think that completely overshadows his political sort of gains. I think that he will be remembered for, as we've already said, obviously bringing an independence referendum for the Scottish people, but I think it is a sort of dark cloud over his legacy, and I think that the two will be remembered sort of in tandem.
Douglas, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to get away from it. It's very hard to kind of comment on it, I guess. No one really knows exactly what happened. He was obviously cleared in court, but his lawyer at a court at the time admitted that some of his behaviour was perhaps unbecoming of someone in his position. And I guess it just kind of adds everything to the tapestry that was, Alex Salmond's life. Whether it can continue or not, certainly it sounds like his allies would like it to continue. Whether this makes it easier for the truth to come out or harder for the truth to come out, we don't know. He certainly felt he had a case. He'd already won a substantial sum for the Scottish Government. And I guess it's quite sad that that's going to be part of his legacy, but it's a very difficult one. It's difficult. People have been kind of tiptoeing around it, I think, for the past few days, aware that obviously his family and friends are still in a period of grieving, but it's something that's going to need to be addressed eventually, whether that's in the court of law, who knows. But yeah, I mean, it's just part. It's all part of an extraordinary story, you have to say, regardless of your political persuasion. It's been an extraordinary rise to the top, quite a fall, and yeah, I mean, he'll definitely go down as a history maker, regardless. In 10 years' time, whether that's good or bad, I guess time will answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point and a good one to end on. So I'd like to thank Hannah Rodger, the Sunday Mail chief reporter, and yourself, Douglas Dickie, the content editor at the Scottish Daily Express, for your time today. Alex Salmond, obviously an extraordinary political career, as we've discussed today, and his legacy, I'm sure, will be celebrated and contested in the years to come. I'd like to thank you for listening, and tune in again in the coming weeks when Holyrood resumes from recess, and I'm sure we'll be talking about all the other things that'll be happening at the Scottish Parliament. But thanks again for your time, and we'll see you soon.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear.